start with that pesky bit of housekeeping parking. You can go down to P1 and have your ticket validated at the security desk. So thank you for joining us today on this temperate, beautiful September afternoon. We arrived at an important note in Cleveland Book Week, a dive into Dr. George Makari's brilliant history of xenophobia, of fear in strangers. I am going to grab the thing I should have carried forward and read for you what Anisfield Wolf juror Steven Pinker thought, who was a psychologist, when he got to this book of the 400 or so that are submitted every year. And what Dr. Pinker said was, quote, we see countless books that consider instances of racism. Very few seek to understand it as a phenomenon to be studied and analyzed. Of Fear and Strangers does that, free of cliche and jargon. Instead, it is replete with liveliness, wit, and original turns of phrase, unquote. Today, Dr. Makari will read from this book and chat about it with his friend, Dr. Jonathan Sadowsky, the history chair at CWRU, before they welcome your questions. First, though, I have the honor of introducing my friend, Dr. Valentino Zulu, Anisfield Wolf Postdoctorate Fellow in English and Public Humanities at Ursuline College. Dr. Zulu is a national expert on comics and unfailingly, he's an expert on comics and training as a psychotherapist. He is endlessly curious, unfailingly kind, and I am happy to say, my neighbor, in all the Mr. Rogers ways. Valentino will introduce Dr. Sadowsky and Dr. Makari. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I did not know I was going to be compared to Mr. Rogers. I did write here that I said don't know that my younger self would believe that you would be welcoming me at an event, and certainly not as Mr. Rogers. So I have to add that part. My very younger self would not imagine that. So I am very honored to be here today as an Anisfield Wolf Fellow. I'm proud to be part of such an esteemed tradition at such a venerable institution. Before I introduce you to our speakers today, I wouldn't be a psychoanalyst in training if I didn't share some feelings of mine with you all. I was fortunate enough to be in a class with Professor Sadowsky, who taught me Professor Makari's work at the Cleveland Psychoanalytic Center. I remember that class well, so I was delighted that he would be the one to introduce you or reintroduce you to Professor Makari's work today. I also remember the feeling I had after reading Revolution in Mind, which is Professor Makari's history of the creation of psychoanalysis. I think it's telling when you can remember a feeling you had reading a book of history. That doesn't happen very often, but I had tons of feelings after reading the book. I found myself somewhat despondent, a natural state to be in reading such a chronicle, and you would be too if you read about history of psychoanalysis, you'll be despondent. But I was pulled out of that despair by the sense of hope which persists in Professor Makari's writing. I had a similar experience reading his most recent work on the history of xenophobia. Despite the depressing thoughts which would hover over me during my reading like a dark cloud in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, as my mind wandered to my own history as a Middle Eastern child of immigrants and to our current events, reading Professor Makari's writing guided me through those feelings. He guides us through our shared histories in order to imagine the future, reminding us why our commitment to one another and to the stranger remains necessary today. It's a push that many of us can use at this time, as our respective good works only become more difficult. I hope you all feel similar today after his reading and the discussion. All right, now that I've shared my feelings, I will give you the facts and give you the bios of our speakers. So, Jonathan Sadowsky is the chair of Department of History and the Theodore J. Castle Professor of the History of Medicine, Associate Director of the Program in Medicine, Society, and Culture at Case Western Reserve University. His most recent book is The Empire of Depression, A New History. He just showed me that there's a French translation out, so that's pretty exciting. George Makari is the author of the newly released Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia, the work for which he is honored today. His other works include Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind, and Revolution in Mind, The Creation of Psychoanalysis. I was thinking you should add mind to the third one. He is also the director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute of Psychiatry, History, Policy, and the Arts. Dr. Makari is professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. I will now hand over the microphone to Professor Makari, who will read from his book before talking with Professor Sadowsky. Thank you all for being here today.
What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. Am I cutting in and out, or is the mic functioning okay? Good? I'm going to first say that I'm deeply, deeply honored to be the Anisfield Wolf winner for nonfiction with the brilliant Taya Miles this year. And I want to thank Karen and the Cleveland Foundation for the amazing work that they do. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to read you from the beginning of the book that sets up the challenges that then Professor Sadowsky and I will talk about to what extent I successfully met those challenges. I was in London in 2016 doing a book tour for Soul Machine, my second book, and I had dinner with friends, and they told me about this weird thing called Brexit that was never going to happen, not to worry about it. I told them about Donald Trump. He's a clown. There's no way. We woke up and discovered something really different had happened. And xenophobia was such a commonly used term to try to explain what was happening. It was dictionary.com's word of the year. And I started to look into it because, well, first of all, I'm a child of immigrants. And I should say that's last of all, because I backed into that knowledge. I first started with I need a project. And Soul Machine had so much to do with what we know about the mind and the complication of how one mind knows and misknows another mind, that it seemed like maybe this was a political and social downstream effect of that more philosophical and psychological problem. And then I started to do research and encountered myself and my own family history. But so I'm going to read to you now from the prologue, which is called Out of Beirut. There'll be no Beirut in it, but at least I'll tell you a little about how I thought about my project. The beginning of the story, I assumed, would be as old as humankind. Ever since our first ancestors emerged on the eastern plains of Africa, humans have been on the move. A migratory species, Homo sapiens, would settle in one place, then, due to fear, enemies, drought, famine, pestilence, or some wild hope over the horizon, move on. While craving home, a stable and predictable resting place swaddled in memory and meaning, we have always been compelled to go. From Adam and Eve's expulsion, to the defeated warriors of Troy, or the lost Hopi tribes far from their mesas, our myths speak of those who voyage forth from a blessed place, unsure of their next resting place. Once dusty layers of forgetting are swept away, who does not descend from such a journey? Whether it was last week in a dinghy, or centuries ago alongside a regal army, whether it was bound in chains or draped in silk, haven't we all at some point settled as wide-eyed aliens in a swarming foreign place? Once these wanderers docked or crossed over the hills, they eventually stumbled upon others who had preceded them. Stranger and stranger came face to face. Now, such uneasy encounters must be as ancient as our species. And so, when colleagues discovered I was working on a history of xenophobia, they were befuddled. How could I write a history of fears that seemed intrinsic to all time? It seemed quixotic, Borgesian, like writing a universal chronicle of laughter. Our earliest writing records indicate that in many civilizations, strangers were broadly conceived of as objects of fear and mistrust. Some have gone so far as to speculate that for primal man, all strangers were de facto enemies. In a number of languages, the words for stranger and enemy are the same. Xenophobia, then, one might conclude, is an everlasting trouble bred deep in the human heart. As such, any history of this behavior would need to gather up all the spilled blood and cracked skulls that lay in the earth, an infinite task without beginning or end. Of Fear and Strangers is not that. It does not seek to record all those mistreated, enslaved, or slaughtered in ways we might today consider xenophobic. Rather, it is an account of another history that lay hidden in that word. Who, I began to wonder, first deemed such reactions phobic, that is, irrational and mistaken? How and where was there an awakening of conscience by which some proclaimed it unreasonable to mistreat strangers? How did those voices create an ethic by which such behavior was gradually deemed worthy of censure? And how did varied concepts emerge to account for such dangerous attitudes? In 2016, when I typed XEN into my search engine, nothing popped up that might help with those questions. Yes, there was a definition, the fear and hatred of strangers, but unlike anti-Semitism or racism or homophobia, xenophobia seemed to have no history. Take a look. All you find are passing vague references to Greek antiquity, not much else. This erasure has led some, including some in policy circles, to conclude that the notion itself was empty, little more than an accusation wrapped around thin air. This dismissal, I came to believe, is mistaken. Firstly, xenophobia is categorically different. In speaking of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or homophobia, we name the maligned group, while those who do the discriminating remain somewhat undefined, unknown in and of themselves. Xenophobia corrects that imbalance and directs our attention to the source of the trouble, thereby opening up a critical line of inquiry. For, as a century of thinkers from Josiah Royce to James Baldwin have noted, our language has too often unwittingly implied that the nature of the trouble lay within the defining qualities of the problem group. That's in scare quotes. What if America's social strife, Royce asked in 1908, was better defined not by reference to a black peril or a yellow peril, but rather by the presence of what he called a white peril? What was it with them? Of Fear and Strangers tells of a series of attempts to isolate, define, investigate, and answer that question. Thank you.
Thanks for that lovely reading and well read as well. Before I start asking my questions, I just wanted to mention that when I was first asked and honored to be asked to join this event, my immediate reaction was, oh, this is great. George and I have known each other for years, which is also great because I'm scared of strangers. Sorry, I couldn't resist. You know, George, the passage you read from, it occurs to me, speaks to a kind of duality of this, which is your theme is at once in some ways timeless, and yet in other ways up to the minute topical, even speaking to, say, Ron DeSantis's actions just today, right? So, and I wonder also if you might be able to speak a little bit to one of the other crises that we've been enduring over the last few months, namely the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you for that impossible question. So the reason it's impossible and the reason why I felt like I had to write this book is that xenophobia is a word that packs so much into it. And unless we break it apart into a couple of parts so we can think critically about each part, it's really very easy to get vague and to get confused. So, you know, I argue that xenophobia has to be understood based on it's a three-headed monster. And it's in the word that the xenos is a question about identity. So struggles about who's the stranger and who's the host, who's us and who's them, that's identity. The phobia part is about affect. It's about fear. It's about fight or flight. It's about threat regulation. So that's part of the problem too. And then the third part, as everyone has suggested as they study this phenomena, it has something to do with the individual's relationship to groups, to social groups. So when you start to break it down like that, you can start thinking more critically about contemporary events. And, you know, I had to ask the question, I came to the end of the book, and the end of the book for me in my other books is very, very comfortably deep in the past. My first book ended in 1945. My second book ended in 1900. You know, except I couldn't really end this book there. So I did try to take up the questions that Jonathan is asking and to ask, why has there been a resurgence, right? Political scientists have called the new xenophobia something that has been resurging for the past, and then the question is how long. I would argue that it's about 25 years. But when you look at what was happening in 2016, as I did, more naively, you saw, okay, in France there's a rise in xenophobia. In Italy there's a rise of xenophobia. In Hungary there's a rise of xenophobia. You saw these formerly more committed to globalized liberal democracies having counter movements within their societies. The United States, India, South Africa. It seemed like it was happening in a lot of places, and so I wanted to try to have some vision about how and why that was happening. And of course it's crude because history is going to look back on this as a kind of like an attempt without all the data. But I think it has to do with globalization. I think that this story tells of the second wave of globalization and an emergence of a huge amount of new technology that put people in touch. That was around 1900. That was the telegraph and the telephone and Reuters and these media services that now would bring lots of information to people from all around these newly globalized, by force, colonized countries, right? It was globalization at the end of a gun. And so 6 or 7 European countries controlled a vast amount of the world. They would all get news about that world. That world suddenly seemed much, much smaller. So when I looked at how xenophobia emerged, because it turned out that what people had said that it was from antiquity was completely wrong. There is no word xenophobia in ancient Greek. There are 2 roots from Greek, but the word was coined in the 1880s and then was really popularized in 1900. And it was in that big context. When you look at that context, you think, okay, well, maybe we're having another wave of the same thing. Digital life, having your identity stolen. I said, you know, that's a metaphor as well as a reality that we're afraid of. These new communities that are forming online, the distress about globalization. So yes, I think that there's a lot of broader ways of thinking about it. And then I think there's a more local way of thinking about it, which is there's a lot of distress within EU countries. And frankly, it seems like now the more conspiratorial theory, which I was wondering about but careful about, is also true, which is that there was one country that was deeply, deeply invested in fragmenting the EU and the United States and fostering a white Christian Orthodox nationalism, and they were funding a lot of it, and that was Russia. So the invasion of the Ukraine actually was like an aha moment for a lot of folks, that this is like a little bit like the invasion of Poland, that there's something that's been building, and we didn't know exactly where it was coming from. I'm not suggesting the Russians created this. I'm saying they saw the possibility to fracture liberal communities and took advantage of it.
A follow-up question. As you were speaking about all of the trends over the last 25 years, a word came to my mind, namely neoliberalism. Now, you're very careful in the book to avoid economic determinism, not just on principle, but because the data don't bear it out. That's what you show. And yet, I wonder is it possible as well that we need to put into the mix the assaults on economic security. There was a broad consensus in the industrialized world following World War II that the state ought to make sure everyone is at least remotely taken care of, and that consensus started facing, started being attacked in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very, I don't know how broad the consensus was, by the way, after 1945, but let's just say it was broader. And my argument is a bit counterintuitive. I say that the end of the Cold War was a catastrophe for, of course, those who believed in the Soviet Union. It was a great liberation for those who didn't, but it was a catastrophe, a shameful catastrophe, and we're seeing some of that in the Russian nationalism today. It was also a big problem for the red, white, and blue. Without the Reds kept a common core, a common enemy for middle-of-the-ground politics, and it was very much imperative for the United States to, even just at the level of propaganda, not allow the Soviets to say what they would say over and over again. Look at how they treat the blacks. Look at how they treat the poor. And so there's an argument that the State Department pushed civil rights primarily to counter Soviet propaganda. And they wanted some sort of movement on these fronts, and they wanted some sort of way that our capacity for the welfare state could be a sensible argument against communism. The collapse of communism, I think, and this is a little bit like what's happened. It happened in other empires when Carthage collapsed. Rome collapsed afterwards. The collapse of a common enemy, which bonded a lot of the United States together, also left it with this notion that neoliberalism, that capitalism is the end of history. Fukuyama's argument that capitalism had won, and that free market capitalism had won. Unrestrained, it would self-regulate. I love the people who talked about self-regulation as if they knew what it was, and it was going to self-regulate, and it allowed for, I think, the kinds of excesses, the cutting away that started, even before the end of the Cold War with Ronald Reagan, but it allowed the partisans of that view to feel like they had won the war of ideas. And it then became, I think, quite unrestrained. And when we go around to communities, we see how globalization and the lack of support for a lot of communities in the United States has put a lot of threat before folks. The problem is to go back to what you said about economic determinism. When you look at the data does not bear out that it is folks who are just in economic distress who become white nationalists. It's not true. And I say, it's a disservice to people who have suffered economic distress to say that they necessarily become xenophobic. No, they have economic distress. Why do some become xenophobic? And that's where some of these more complex arguments have to be built that aren't so reductive.
Well, speaking of complex, one of the things that makes your book complex is that it works in three registers, it seems to me. And it's at once a linguistic history of a word, it's an intellectual history of the concept that the word refers to, and it's a social and political history of the phenomena that the concept refers to. Right. Okay, and I was admired how you managed to weave through those three strands, and I want to talk a little bit more about maybe each of them, but to focus on the linguistic history for a minute. So the word, as so many words have, migrated from the medical domain, and it's no longer a medical term, really. In fact, it had a very, very brief, history. And yet I wonder if, like some other words that have migrated from the medical domain, if it doesn't carry some medical connotation still or resonance, and if so, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Let me just, this is your show, so I don't want to talk too much, but just to clarify the question a little bit. So maybe to be more specific, what is lost and what is gained when we describe a prejudice or a form of bigotry as a phobia? You know, we also speak now of transphobia, homophobia. As you know, early activists for racial equality spoke of color phobia or negrophobia, words that aren't used anymore.
Yes, and that's a great question. Let me just start at the beginning because I want to. The idea that we both are in the domain of history of psychiatry, and in history of psychiatry, there's a really important set of distinctions. Hermann Berrios is very good about this. History of the term is different from history of the conceptual explanation of a phenomenon is different from what he calls behavioral paleontology, which is to say, going way back in time before anyone else would have thought that this was xenophobia and calling it xenophobia. And those were really helpful guidelines to not get lost. So I really do deploy those guidelines, and this is a book that really starts out very much about the history of the coining of a term and how it makes sense in a discursive universe. And then and luckily for me, they kind of happen sequentially. People start to look at what causes this, and I have the history of the concept. And the social and political history kind of follows along both tracks. So, so your question is about phobos. Now, one of the only things that actually mattered in the medical moment because Jonathan's absolutely right. It's one of the earliest usage is when there's this massive naming kind of fury among psychiatrists, and they're naming everything phobias. They ended up with 77 before people started to go like, okay, there's really not that many. And this was one, and it died. It was a quick death. But one of the things that was lasting was exactly your point. Phobos in Greek just means fear. But phobia, after that medical intervention, meant irrational fear. And that was the critical difference. There was something irrational about it. It was outside of reason. You did not need to fear the stranger. And that ends up carrying forward and giving meaning to the word. Now, how much it dies off, and really very few people have suggested it is an illness. And I say it is not an illness. It merely is one of the darkest corners of the normal human mind. You know, that for those who need ugly things to be medicalized, I say get to know human beings better. You know, that we do many. You know, the argument about gun violence, et cetera, is charged by this notion that normal people don't do horribly violent, terrible things. It's just not true. So that notion of a phobia at least gives a cast that says it is irrational, and human beings are irrational all the time. It doesn't mean you're ill. So that the xenos is not actually someone who's coming to kill you, someone who's threatening your livelihood or your life, and you're afraid nonetheless. And that at least frames the question in a way that allows you to then pursue it further.
Is there anything lost in using phobos? Is there aspects of the problem that aren't captured well?
I think so, because if you just use phobos, if it was just fear of strangers, that could be perfectly rational. I say, you know, before you call something xenophobic, you really have to have a kind of rule out. The two major arguments are that it's rational because it's economic competition, right? You have a community and 1,000 Afghan refugees come and they start to undermine, you know, wages for a number of folks, and therefore there is a threat. Okay, that's a rational threat that does not need to be called xenophobic. Similarly, there's a cultural invasion argument. You have a small town of 20,000 people and you get 1,000 folks from some foreign country who are refugees who come to your town, and they start changing the culture of your place, and you don't like their places of worship taking over yours, and there's a struggle to maintain a kind of culture. I also say that's not necessarily xenophobic. People like other people who are like them. That's human. And it doesn't have to necessarily be xenophobic. So I think you lose the irrational part of it if you just say it's fear. And that to me is the critical element, that there has to be a fair weighing of these things before we jump to the conclusion that something is xenophobic.
Thanks. Towards the end of the book, you show how, I think very effectively, how no one approach is going to work. We need different disciplines, different fields to understand this. And that's true of most complex things. But I want to talk about one particular field for a moment, which is one of your other expertises, which is psychoanalysis. Does psychoanalysis bring anything special or in particular to the study of this problem that you can't get anywhere else, even with its limitations?
Yeah. The answer is I argue absolutely. And let me backtrack a little by saying what the other models are. So the first model that was put forward to explain this was through behaviorism. And basically it was these experiments that showed like that you have a baby, you show him a white rat, he's not afraid of the white rat. Well, every time you show him the white rat, you crash a symbol behind his head, he gets terrified of white rats. And suddenly he's terrified of all animals. This is the experimental creation of a phobia. And the idea was that that was a conditioned fear. So was it true that, for example, white America was conditioned to be afraid of black males? Okay, that's therefore an argument. And there is, a beautiful follow-through on that argument. We find that if you actually stop crashing the symbol and show the kid the white rat and give him a cupcake every time there's a white rat, he starts to like white rats again. So assimilation is an exposure are the behaviorist models that, what is that at the political level? It's integration. It's desegregation. That's why Plexi Ferguson was such a disaster. Bring people together, have them play basketball, have them play baseball, have them play bridge, the same group, and I get to know, okay, they're kind of all the same. That's the behaviorist model, passive model of the mind. I'm going to get your question. The second part is a cognitive model of the mind, and it says basically we're idea machines. And if you simply go to a movie, you have no crashing symbol. You go to a movie, it happens to be Birth of the Nation, you leave with an idea about black men. And that's called a stereotype, right? That's how the notion of stereotype starts to enter the psychological kind of domain. And you have a stereotype, but you've never had a terrible experience, so it's not like the behaviorists. Again, passive model of the mind. And you simply learn these things. Well, we know what to do about that. You can unlearn them. Start having movies where Whoopi Goldberg plays God. Start, showing a fuller three-dimensional portrait of different groups, And if you can miseducate people, you can re-educate them. Passive. Okay, what about the folks who you put them on the teams with? You put them, you show them the literature that's anti-racist, and they don't care. They want to hate. But that's where you need an active model of the mind, and that's where psychoanalysis comes in. Psychoanalysis is a model that says there is a desire, a need to demean and to hate. And where does that come from? Those are the core group that they're not going to go to your anti-discrimination training. They're not going to go to see the movie where Whoopi Goldberg plays God. They don't want to. And those other models simply can't account for that. But the model of psychoanalysis with the notion of projection and the way that people manage shame by needing a degraded other, I argue is a very important addition to our way of thinking about what causes this problem.
Yeah, I want to stay with projection for a moment because I myself think it's really important for this subject. I don't know if you know this. There's a really good book on psychoanalysis and race by Celia Brickman. But anyway, what Brickman, it's about the origins of psychoanalysis during the colonial era and shows the ways in which Freud and others, though in some ways progressive for their time, were imbued with certain primitivist discourses from their day. And the reason I bring up Brickman's book is that it's very effective at showing how over the course of European colonialism, which, as you know, I'm a historian of that as well, during the course of European colonialism, colonialists, imperialists frequently mistook the effects that they had wrought for the causes. For example, they would see people living in squalor created by the poverty their presence had generated and conclude the people were primitive. Now, it might seem like a remote bridge, but I am getting back to xenophobia here, because what I thought was one of the most eye-opening things in A Fear of Strangers was its early use as a projection. Maybe you can talk about that. I'm going to give you you can talk about it however you want, but to me, one of the captivating examples of this was the Boxer Rebellion. So maybe dwell on that for a minute.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. This is kind of behavioral paleontology, to go back and say this is what projection looks like. And it was, in fact, the founding, the popularization of the notion of xenophobia. So it was terribly shocking to me, but this is the wonderful thing about doing research. You find things you don't anticipate. I'm tracking this word, and I discover all of a sudden in all the French newspapers they're using this word. There's like a pivotal moment, and they're all using it about the same thing: the Boxer Rebellion in China. So the Boxers were kind of a ragtag army of rebels who were watching the Chinese Empire dissolve and be eaten up by 6 or 7 European colonists. It was being colonized and chipped away at here and there. And they revolted, and their motto was simply support the Qing, I think it was kill the strangers or exterminate the strangers, something like that. Suddenly in all the French newspapers, this word, which was dying, frankly, it was kind of a very secondary usage in politics, and it was trivial in medicine. It was on the way to the waste bin of history, right? It's everywhere, and it becomes popularized. And it becomes popularized about a lot of other colonized people. In other words, this now names a racial, inferior kind of primitive fear that people have of strangers, that these folks don't know that we're coming for their own good. And they hate us, and they want to kill us. The Moroccans are doing it to the Spanish. Why? The Ethiopians are doing it to the Italians. Why? The Mexicans are doing it to Americans. Why? And especially the Chinese are doing it to, well, a whole bunch of different colonizers. The word went viral in both colonies, where people were terribly worried. Could this illness be happening amongst the primitives that we're living with? And in the metropoles, where people are reading about this and where they're worried about what's happening to all of their colonies. And the kind of, historian kind of like $64,000 question moment, who coined the term? I actually found the person. It was unbelievable, because luckily he was a braggart. And 15 years after he left Reuters, this man named Jean-Martin de Saint-Tours said, he cranky guy, arguing about lots of stuff. He's a letter to the editors kind of guy. He writes a letter to the editor in the Globe, and as a parenthetical notion says, oh, by the way, 15 years ago I coined the term xenophobe, and isn't it wonderful? Now it's in a lot of dictionaries. So he was sitting at a media hub at Reuters. He got the dispatch from Shanghai, and he named the thing xenophobia, sent it out to all the media outlets, and so it went viral. It is a xenophobic use of xenophobia that then had to be it had to be turned around by 25, 30 years of ethicists and moralists who took the term, saw the irony in it. Like, really, they're the only xenophobes? How come the British Brothers League is like right next door to us? And how come the KKK are doing what they're doing? And how come in France we have, so you see, ethicists, 25 years 30 years of effort, they turn it around and start to make it an ethic of self-reflection. The critical part of this, I should say, given that this is the mandate of the award that I just won, is that this was all buttressed by racial science. There was no question that these people were racially inferior, and that one thing that might be attached to that is this primitive notion that they're afraid of strangers. So it was only really the attack on racial science and flipping that around to le racisme, racism, that you start to see people pivot away from this and go, this is ridiculous, this is nonsense.
So you point out another thing that comes up towards the end of the book is that shaming the xenophobe seems not to work.
Yeah.
And in fact only kicks their defenses into higher gear or causes them to double down, whatever idiom you want to use to describe it. Could you, I'm really interested in the psychology of this. How does this work exactly? Where does the shame come from to begin with? And how does it reproduce itself in the psyche?
Yeah, look, I'm so glad you asked that question. So, because I didn't elaborate on it in retrospect, I've been thinking about it a lot since I kind of put that out in the end of the book, that what we're suffering from in the United States are shamed subcultures. And I say, what is the claim of white superiority other than a confession of white inferiority? You know, this is a defensive strategy that we know very, very well. And it happens in shamed communities. You know, anthropologists talk about shame cultures and guilt cultures. And in guilt cultures, you know, you can do something wrong but still be a good person. And those cultures tend to be very legalistic, very critical about what's right and what's wrong, and able to adapt to those things. Shame cultures, you're bad or good. You're good or evil. It's a totalizing, terrible feeling that's kind of intolerable. And if you read, for instance, the mailings, this is quite amazing, really. I don't know if they're doing this consciously or they just feel it, but a lot of the requests to give money to Donald Trump play very much on the notion that we are so upset that you haven't yet given. Are you going to really leave us behind? Are you really going to be one of them? There is a lot of shame that is activated. And, you know, so I think there are subcultures in this country that feel a deep shame. They feel like they're losing ground. And they didn't, and it is a way of stabilizing oneself to have a projection of an inferior other. So that is the psychoanalytic notion. I'm not so sure shame is bad globally. Like, shame actually stops you from doing bad things if you actually don't feel totally ashamed of yourself. But if you shame someone who's already feeling ashamed, this is where narcissistic rage, I'm using lingo now, but it makes people enraged. They get furious. They don't go, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that. The first two groups, the group that, you know, has that other anxiety that is kind of normal, like, you're weird, I've never talked to anyone like you. Oh, you're not so weird. Okay, all right. A little shame about doing bad things is good for them. People have had too many stereotypes. A little shame is also helpful to, you know, help us. Oh God, I shouldn't have said that, right? That happens to all of us, I hope. Happens to me. If you are deeply committed to this model, you don't respond well to those moments. They threaten your self-esteem.
Your comments remind me of something which, if I remember correctly, comes from Richard Wright, another figure you talk about in this book, although not sure if you actually talk about this particular thing that Wright said. But if I remember correctly, at one point, Richard Wright said that racism actually got worse after slavery, because during slavery, white people had the imprimatur of the law to tell them that they were superior, and that once emancipation came, they lost that imprimatur. That's
so interesting. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about Wright at all?
Well, Sure, I'm happy to talk about Richard Wright. Richard Wright is a fascinating and brilliant writer. I think he's been mistreated by literary critics as a kind of crude writer. He's not. He packs an amazing punch, and that's craft, and that's linguistic brilliance. The thing that I wrote about was this archival finding that kind of came from being a bit of a book bibliophile. So I collect, not that many, but I do collect some books, and I had a first edition of Native Son. And in the first edition of Native Son, never to be seen after the first edition, there is a mortifying introduction by the person who actually was the head of the Book of the Month Club and helped fund the book, and wrote about the book as a equivalent to the behavioral experiments of the white rats and stuff like that. And it was taken out after the first edition. I don't know if I found this first or I was in the archives and I found the stuff in the Wright archives at Yale. But what became really clear to me was that Native Son was structured around America being a really sick behavioral experiment on black people. And if you remember the opening of the book, the first thing is a bell ringing. That's Pavlov's bell. And this set of frightened reactions by the main character and his family. They're all living in one room. And finally them chasing a white rat around the room and reacting differently. His mother retreats in fear. His sister faints. He kills the white rat. And so if you track that through the book, there are a number of ways that you see that he, as both a communist who believed in social determinism and someone who deeply read the behaviorist literature, was suggesting that this is exactly what's happened to black Americans. They can choose whether to faint, whether to retreat in fear, or whether to fight, and as an act of suicide, you will die. And that's with Native Son.
So we're going to transition to audience Q&A in a moment. If I can, I'd like to ask one more question of my own. Just as a preface to the question, when the COVID pandemic began, a gathering of my colleagues, historians of medicine, took place online, first online conference I ever attended, and not the last though. And all the experts on infectious disease history spoke, all the major leading figures. And they all made predictions. We were talking before about historians making predictions. They all made predictions about what would happen. And a lot of the predictions came true. They predicted there would be resistance to public health measures. They predicted that the poor and discriminated against already would feel the burden greater than other people would of the pandemic. Why did they know this? They know this because they'd seen it in other pandemics, and the other thing that they predicted was that there would be scapegoating. And of course, we saw that there was scapegoating. We've seen that. This is all leading to the question that, it's getting back to what Valentino was talking about before, about how do we feel hopeful? Because the recurrence of this kind of scapegoating in pandemics, just as one example, and many other examples that we could take from your book, can lead to a certain sense of resignation. What is our best bet here?
I think that we have to make a few bets and hedge. In the paperback of this book, I've decided that at the very end, I'm going to put a table that says something about, what, if it's this kind of problem, we do this. If it's this kind, as a historian, as a writer, I kind of hate the idea of doing that, but I realized that it would be helpful. So I would say that we know what to do about some of these problems, but we have to break it up and think about it. Desegregation works. Bring people together works. I mean, this is the mandate of this wonderful Anisfield Wolf community. It works for a group of people. It brings down stranger anxiety. It does work. Attacking stereotypes. rewriting those histories. You know, Ishmael Reed just rewrote about 17 different million, you know, stereotypes in one talk earlier this afternoon, where, you know, the history that we learn molds our thinking in ways that is very parochial and needs to change because we're becoming a more diverse society. And our histories need to reflect that. We know that that's important. When you get to the problem of projection and people who have a kind of harder core commitment to hatred, it's very critical to recognize that meeting it head on will do nothing. The only way you meet it head on by protecting the potential victims. That's about very, very clear legal protection. But then you have to recognize that there are problems that are around the corner from that. That if we all are Americans, that even those people should be considered not beyond the pale. That would be doing the exact same thing as being xenophobic, except in reverse. And we need to understand how to, in some way, address the distress of some of these communities that have taken up, essentially, white Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. Now, how we do that, I really am not sure, but I do think that's the direction you go in to try to bring the country more together.
So, I'm sure you'll be happy to take questions from the audience.
I am. I see someone in the back there with their hand up. Yeah. Yeah, you go ahead.
Comment on the result of the recent election in Sweden. Afraid of strangers, yeah?
I honestly, I haven't even had a chance to read about it yet, so I don't know. But I could say that the problem in the EU is a general one. I mean, look, my wife grew up in southern part of France, right near the border in Spain. One of our very good friends is a peach farmer. Works like the Dickens, fabulous person, fabulous farm, really does a great job. The EU has crushed her, right? We don't talk about politics with her because we're not really sure exactly where she would come down on the fact that the Spanish have been able to kind of co-opt that entire market. So disruptions of that sort are not really amenable to like global solutions. And people start to look for kind of xenophobic answers. There is a wonderful quote from an old American journalist who said, you know, for every complex, difficult problem, there is an elegant, simple answer that's wrong. And that's what we face in a lot of the EU countries where I argue that the EU came together with the collapse of the Soviet Union, saved us lots of civil wars, saved us lots of deaths. I can articulate that more if you want me to. But now we've seen like what it looks like to also have a lot of trouble because Brussels looks like it's controlling your national interest. And so I think this is going to be a problem in all the different EU countries. So Sweden, I don't think, is different.
You mean the EU is going, in general, is going to vote right?
I think there's going to be right-wing movements within each European Union nation that's going to articulate this more nationalist perspective. And we'll see how it shakes out. Yes?
So, you know, you were saying it's an individual basis. Evolution probably allowed you to survive. That's why you have this little corner in you which you have fear of strangers. But then when you're talking about the Boxer revolution and how the word suddenly came into papers, is that the point where it jumped from an individual to a social and a tool of power?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me just say that the evolutionary argument that we naturally have some stranger fear has a certain value to it. What needs to be put side by side with that is probably the most important adaptive mechanism we have is to learn how to cooperate. That was the way we didn't end up all with little tribes constantly fighting each other, but merging with others and creating these very large, very powerful societies where there are hierarchical kind of different people do different things. And so the people who make this kind of simplistic Darwinian argument that it's just in our nature, I really think are wrong. Is there something in our nature? But yes, I call that other anxiety. And I say that's a real thing, but we know how to manage that. Recognition, dialogue, exposure, it generally goes away. You had another part of your question.
So the Boxer event, it suddenly brought the word into the French media.
Yeah.
And is that the point where it jumped from an individual fear to use as a social?
I think so. I think that's exactly right. That's when the notion of that thing stops being individual and starts to become very widely used for whole communities. I think there's someone in the back and then someone in the front. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the concept, the word tribal and tribalism, which you use in the book.
Yes.
But you don't define it. And I found out, I read about the colonized opinion, some people's opinion of the use of that term. 2000, because of environmental justice.
Okay.
That's what I was looking into.
Right.
And 2018, there was an article in the Washington Post that caused a stir. Christine Mumble from Kenya said that there's a problem using the words tribal and tribalism because it's historically inaccurate when you consider the actual behavior of indigenous peoples. And goes on, she calls the use of the word tribal a racial stereotype. And that, I don't know, is that controversy something that is in your...
I did my best, and I would hope that I avoided any kind of connotation that this was not a kind of it was a word. I don't think I used the word in any way to connote that it only applied in some way to lesser developed communities. I used it really as a word that was synonymous with a community that had a lot of interdependent commitments. And so in that sense, I hope that I avoided anything of that sort, but thank you for asking me to think about it. Yes, and then back.
I was wondering if the non-rational disposition to hatred stems from assaults on the integrity of children. And as a child grows up, that integrity isn't resolved and they need to express the rage. The hatred becomes a disposition to aggression, and then they have to find a modality for expressing it.
Yes. So in the book, it's a very interesting question, and that's really the deep dive, right, of the psychoanalytic perspective is like you have to go back to childhood. Now, Theodore Adorno and the group that studied authoritarian personality made precisely that argument, what you said, which is to say, they said that people who become pro-authoritarian have grown up in families with authoritarian parents who have crushed them emotionally, and therefore those children learn to do two things: idealize authoritarians and have a huge amount of aggression that they need to take out on the demeaned group. So this is his argument for how the power in the family structure ends up manifesting itself in the political structure. So that's kind of along the lines of your argument. Yes, in the back.
I have the privilege of quoting you to you.
Oh no.
In the end, what was at stake was nothing less than fundamental notions of identity, of I and thou, us and them, stranger and host, that had been thrown into question by new forms of global interconnection and radical technological change, disruptions not unlike the ones we face today.
Oh, I so agree with that. Thank you. That was very kind of you. I wish I had said that. I mean, I did say that.
We have time for one more question, so.
Okay, there's someone right there. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a question, and I'm not trying to speechify, but here's what you did to me today. Sir, it was you that did it. With teaching me, or opening up my mind to the idea that the loss of imprimatur, that owning black people was the way that life is supposed to be. And I have lived in the South, and I think, we've all observed that we seem to, civil war is still going on, and it's still meaningful that something that was a comfort and a social norm got ripped away for some people. I couldn't help but think about the same thought when it comes to how women want to unite and respond to what the Supreme Court did, because legality of abortion was ripped away. And this was our perception of how the world should be for ourselves and our daughters. So now we have, when you look at it, displacement and disbursement of ideas and expectations. And it puts us into that human turmoil. Now, we already said that we don't know how to answer that. We don't have a cookbook with recipes. But I have to say that it's a head-on collision I'm looking at. If you have anything to say to perhaps nuance what I'm saying.
I'm not 100% sure that I understand, completely understand your thought process, because to my mind, losing the right to control your own body is not the same as losing the power to control others' bodies. And I'm sure you agree with that, right? There is, so I wouldn't want to flatten out that difference. It should have been something that from numerous ethical streams was processable as a virtue to end slavery. And I understand that there's some folks from some religious points of view that see it as a virtue to try to end abortion. But I think there are so many other ways of thinking about how this has been an extraordinary assault on women. So yeah, I can't really flatten out that difference. What I would say is vote, vote, vote.
I think we should all give Dr. Makari a hand.